Hi everyone, welcome to SusaCon 2023 and my name is Lasit Singh. I'm a solution architect at SUSE based in Australia. Today I want to talk about role-based access control with Rancher. Now the agenda for this session is that first we want to understand the importance and components of Kubernetes RBAC or role-based access control. And next I want to talk about Rancher and RBAC together. And finally, let me do a quick live demo around Rancher RBAC capabilities. Role-based access control, what it means in the Kubernetes universe. RBAC is a form of identity and access management where it involves a set of permissions or template that determine who, what, and where. Who as in the subjects. So these are the users, groups, processes that are allowed to access based on verbs, which is the what part. Verbs are the set of operations that can execute on resources. Now, and where is in the is the namespace. These are pretty much the objects that are available on the clusters. They can be pods, services, nodes, things that make up the Kubernetes. Now, Kubernetes administrators use RBAC to allow subjects such as users, groups, or service accounts to access or modify resources in clusters. We all know that when we follow the security best practices, subjects should only have necessary permissions and administrators must use caution when granting those privileges that are associated with escalation risks. Now, these include permissions that enable subjects to list all the secrets or create workloads, certificates, or token requests that could allow them to modify their own privileges. Recently, pretty much last year, Datadog did a report, and based on this report, the good news is that as organizations deploy more clusters, there's a decreasing percentage of those clusters using overly permissive privileges. Based on the content of this report, they suspect that the number is coming down as organizations are adopting security practices such as permission audits or tools to automate the RBAC scanners. However, as you can see on the screen with the graph, there's a 40%, about 40% of clusters still use less restrictive privileges, which presents a security risk. Now, a similar report has been done by SysDic around cloud native security and usage. Now, this report talks about that when it comes to user permissions, 90% of accounts have excessive permissions, which is scary, right? Usually, the DevOps teams tend to grant more permission than needed so that things will work as expected. We have seen these things, right? And leave security in the background. So it's best to enforce least privileges so that it will help to reduce attack opportunities. And this report talks about those risks. Now, with all these findings from these reports, tells us that we need to pay more attention on Kubernetes RBAC. Why? Because Kubernetes RBAC is a key security control. Most of the workloads and clusters have sensitive data. Right? We need to make sure that users will have access only to the resources required to execute their roles. And of course, maintaining that separation. We don't want everyone to see everything. You should see only what you've been allowed to access. So, key security control when it comes to Kubernetes RBAC. Then we have compliance requirements to meet. We also need to make sure that we update the RBAC policies in time to time. Review them in a timely manner so that you make sure you don't leave any doors open for attackers to attack. And of course, finally, follow the best practices. Okay, now I thought of including some of the key words around RBAC. First is about a user. Who is a user? A user can be a developer, an administrator, a process in a pod, a service account. Along with the user, we come across the word called roles. Basically, it contains rules and permissions that grants access to a resource within a particular namespace. Roles are a type of namespace resource because user access to a workload is determined by what clusters are included in the specific namespace. Yeah, there's a lot of words in that. Um, when it comes to cluster role, a cluster role is a resource without a namespace. So these two resources, a role and a cluster role, have different names because all Kubernetes objects must always be namespaced or non-namespaced, which means the same object cannot be both. Then we come across another two words, role binding and cluster role binding. Now, role binding means granting the permissions defined by roles to the relevant users or user groups. They may contain a list of service account, users, or groups, basically the subjects, and references to the relevant roles. And with that, uh, role binding grants permission to a specified namespace, while a cluster role grants access to a cluster across the cluster. So I also thought of including these two words, authorization and authentication. In Kubernetes, you must be authenticated, that which is logged in, before your request can be authorized, which is granting permission to access. Um, Kubernetes authorizes API requests using API server. It basically evaluates all of the request attributes against all policies and allows or denies the request based on those policies. All part of an API request must be allowed by some policy in order to proceed. This means that permissions are by default is denied. Right. So which gives an idea what all these words means, right? A role, a cluster role, role binding, cluster role binding, and of course authentication and authorization. Two different functionality, two different meanings. Now let's look at how Rancher and RBAC works together. SUSE Rancher enables centralized authentication and access management, right? It gives you easy integration of all Kubernetes environment with an existing enterprise authentication provider. One of the key features that Rancher adds to Kubernetes is centralizing that user authentication. With this feature, it allows you to create local users or connect to an external authentication provider like LDAP or Azure AD. You might be using SAML or OIDC. Whatever the authentication provided, you can connect it to with Rancher. And by connecting to an external authentication provider, you can leverage that provider's users and groups. And for authorization, within Rancher, each person authenticates as a user, which is a login that grants you access to Rancher. So once the user logs into Rancher, their authorization or their access rights within the system is determined by the user's role. We learned these words in the previous slide, right? So Rancher provides built-in roles that makes it so easy to configure a user's permissions to resources, and also you can also customize these roles for each Kubernetes resource, which is great. So this is why Rancher is really looks at this capability and gives a really good capability and functionality around RBAC. I thought of adding a couple of screenshots, but we will jump into a live demo. In this slide, this is to show you on how Rancher allows you to use its inbuilt role-based roles based on clusters or projects, or you can even use this global permissions. You can have roles based on projects or namespaces or clusters, or you can have a global permissions. This slide shows how you can set permissions during user creation. Keep in mind, this is a creation of a local user, and during the creation of this local user, you can determine what sort of global permissions that you want to give to that user, whether that user to be a standard user or restrictive administrator or complete full-on administrator. And of course, you can also give additional capabilities along with the apart from the general permissions. Right. Now, let's jump into a quick demo on Rancher RBAC. Now, let me bring my screen up so that one moment, let me do this. Let's bring my screen. Right. So in here, I want to show you, this is the usual Ranch dashboard. You will be logging with a local user. So I'm using the local admin user with the password. You can see, just keep in mind and remember how this login page changes when you connect to a local, to an external authentication provider. So let me log into the system. I've got a local cluster, the cluster that runs the Rancher management server. And then I've got another a cluster running on Amazon EC2 with RKE2, Rancher Kubernetes engine, as the Kubernetes distribution. Now in this section, let's click on the hamburger icon and goes to the users and authentication. This will show us all the local users that's been created in the system. So I've got my default admin user, the user that I use to log into this system. And then I've got a couple of other users named Dinesh and Michael, right? Apart from that, I can also check on the roles that are available within this system. We spoke about, I actually showed you a couple of screenshots in my slides. You can have global roles, you can have cluster-based roles, you can have project-based roles as well. And then you can create groups. So you can assign global roles to a group that works with an external authentication provider, which makes it, let's say, you create a group called clusters, and then you can assign users into that group. People or users in that group will have access to certain limitation to your Kubernetes environment, Rancher. And of course, you can also connect with external authentication providers. Now, I want to go back to my local users and see if I can look at their group memberships. For example, let's take Dinesh and say edit config. Yep, I can see the global permission as a restricted user, a restricted administrator. So the restricted administrator has full control over all the resources in all the downstream clusters, but no access to local cluster, which is the cluster that runs the Rancher management server, the one that I'm logged in. And I haven't really enabled any of the built-in roles, any fine-grained permissions for this user. I'll just leave it as it is. If I go to user Michael, let me just click edit config. Michael is just a standard user, nothing else. So Michael can only can create new clusters and manage clusters and projects they have been granted access to. And that's all he can do. So let's cancel that. And for example, let's go to the AWS cluster and see who has access to this cluster. Right, for this moment, let's go to cluster management and I'll just do a config and just check member roles. Just local admin doesn't have any other access. Right, so let's cancel. And I want to log in as the user Michael. So let's go to home. Let's sign out, log out as admin. And let's see if I can log in with Michael. And as you can see, once you log into Michael, Michael will not see any of the clusters that's been associated with the admin user, the super user, right? Because I haven't granted any permissions. I haven't added Michael into any of the clusters, so he won't see any of the clusters in the system. And you can see he has pretty much less permissions to interact with this environment. So if I go to users authentication, he will only see himself. If you go to roles, the only thing he can change are the roles associated with his with the cluster or a project namespace. Nothing else he can do. He can't do any changes to the global permissions. Right. So let's go back and log in as Dinesh. Right. So let's see. I think I need to check my password. Sorry about that. Let's get my password. So Dinesh is a restrictive administrator. If you remember, the restrictive administrator will have access to all the downstream clusters except for the local cluster, and he has access to the the local cluster. He can interact with the local cluster as a normal user. He can go to cluster management. He can create clusters if he wants. So he's a restrictive administrator. And let's go to users authentication. Again, he can interact because he is a restrictive administrator, except he can't do anything to the Rancher management server. Right? So he's pretty much a admin. Right. So let's log out from this user and log in back as the admin user. So what I want to show you is how you can connect your Rancher management server with the external authentication provider. So for this demo, I'm going to use an Active Directory. So I have set up an Active Directory to show this user case. This is my Active Directory. And if I just show you the Active Directory users and computers. So I've created a couple of users in here, Stephen, Roger, Jason. These are the users that I've created. And also I've created a group called the cluster group. So if I can just click and go to properties, I can see I've got Roger in this cluster group. So I've got one user in this cluster group. So this is the cluster. This is the Active Directory that I'm going to use, and I want to use this Active Directory to authenticate with my Rancher management server. Right, so let's click on Active Directory. I need to give the host name and IP details, so let me bring up those details in here. So the IP to the server, both the Rancher management server and the Active Directory is running on AWS. So I'll make sure that they are all connected, that they can talk to each other. Let's put the IP address of the Active Directory server, 7.171. I want to make sure the port is 389. Everything is as the same, right? And then what I need to do is I need to give the service account. So I created a service account called Service Rancher or SVC-Rancher. And the password for that service account is one moment. Sorry again. Is this one. Okay. And I'm gonna say the default login domain as this, and then I need to give the user search base. So the user search will be cn users, then dc stack, and dc local. Right. I'm gonna leave everything as it is, and then use the admin credentials. So I think I'm using the right username and password. Connect the system. Let's paste. Great. So I managed to connect my Active Directory as the external authentication provider with Rancher, right? So there are a couple of things you can see here. You can configure who should be able to log in and use Rancher. So by default, it says allow any valid user. I can also set it up as allow members of clusters and project plus authorized users and groups only. Or I can restrict access to only the authorized users and groups, right? Just to show you, I'll just restrict access to only the authorized users and groups. So I'm gonna add that cluster group. Remember, we had one user, Roger, who sits under this cluster group. So I want to make sure that only he has access to this system, and just save it. Great. Now, if I click on the users, just see and refresh the group membership, I don't see anything. So let me just, this is the first time I connected the Active Directory to Rancher, so you will not see all the users at the first instance. You need to basically log in from your user credentials, and the system will show all those users. So let me log out from this account. Once you log out, you will see now the system has changed. It gives you two different options. You can use login as a local user, right? I can still log in as Michael, so I'm just going to show you that. It's nothing going to change, right? And then I can also look in with the user as part of the Active Directory. So hopefully, I hope that you not see those passwords again. Let's get this. So let's confirm Roger, whether Roger can log into the system. Right. Great. Yep, Roger can log into the system. I haven't given any permissions for that group, so which means it's more like a standard user, and that's why you see the system as it is. And let's log out and see if we can log in from a different user. Let's take it as Jason, right? We have a user called Jason. He's not part of the cluster group, so let's try to log in as Jason. And let's get his password, and hopefully I'll get the password correct. No, he's not been allowed, so I will copy the password and paste it again. I'm not allowed. So we had another user called Steven. Let me try that user, see if I can log in through that user. No, I'm not allowed to log into this system. And this is what I want to show you. So basically, you can connect your Rancher server with RBAC. Rancher gives that great granular, it's fine-grained granular experience for RBAC. You can connect with Active Directory. You can actually use local users. You can restrict the access. This is the sort of security control that you want to work with. Now, if I just go back and log in as admin, let's see. Administrator. Yep, I'm allowed to use. So that the administrator account is from the Active Directory. And let's go users and authentication. Let's go to groups. Let's assign group roles, and let's say clusters. Sorry. And as you can see, it's a standard user. I want to make it as a restricted user for the demonstration purpose, and just click save. So now he should be a restricted user. Roger should be a restricted user. So let's log out and log in as Roger. And yes, now he can. So we can set permissions in that way. So this is what I want to show you. So as you can see, Kubernetes RBAC is really important. It's a key security control for your whole of Kubernetes. You need to pay more attention as to who should have access to your clusters, to your workloads. You need to have that separation in place. And Rancher provides the best tool and centralizes that the use authentication, and it has its own built-in roles allowing you to easily configure a user's permission to resources. You can also connect with external authentication providers. And with that, thank you for listening to me on this short demo on this very important topic. And I hope you will enjoy the rest of the sessions at SusaCon. Thank you. Bye.